Grateful I had the opportunity to do this work. As you may have noticed on my slide, and as you heard during our introduction, this work was funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. I want to acknowledge that, unfortunately, that is one of the organizations that has been targeted by the current administration, and our grant was canceled earlier this year. So while I'm excited to share this work with you, I also remain uncertain of the future of this work. And so I guess it feels like it's important to acknowledge that context. But so that you know what to expect during the talk today, I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about access in this space. I'll give you an overview of the research project, and then I will touch kind of briefly on the barriers that neurodivergent library workers reported that they were encountering in their workspaces. And then the main focus for today's talk is really about what I'm calling embodied knowledge, and I will explain that later. And then I will be sure to leave some time at the end for question and answer. And before I move on, I also want to make sure that I have started my timer so that I stay on time for all of us today, and we have time for Q&A. All right, so there we go. Thank you for bearing with me there. All right, so I want to acknowledge that everyone has needs. To that end, captioning is on here in the meeting. And then as the speaker at the end, I may need questions to be repeated, or I need time to process those questions before answering. I'm not monitoring the chat too, so Maria will, interrupt me if there's something timely. Otherwise, we'll have questions at the end. You'll probably see me, if you're watching me, I'm gonna fidget, I may stim, you'll definitely see me talking with my hands a lot. So I just invite you to think about how to care for your needs in this space today. The slides will be available afterwards, so if you need to step away, please feel free to do that. I know you probably are familiar with this language, but I felt like it was important to still include this so that you know how I am using these terms, because these terms are sort of in flux and are kind of contested in certain spaces. So I just want to acknowledge that I see neurodiversity as a really big umbrella that includes lots of forms of neurological differences, right? But neurodiversity writ large also includes neurotypical people. And in my work, I define neurotypicals as those whose minds align with dominant social norms and expectations. And so they're the ones who get to be considered typical. And those of us who are neurodivergent, our minds and our ways of being don't align with dominant social norms and expectations. And I know there are other words for this too. Yeah, you may prefer labels like neurodistinct, neuroatypical, neurospicy. And so because we all have our different preferences, this is just a reminder to all of us, and me included, right, that it's always best to ask. Throughout the presentation, you'll also hear me using identity first language. This sort of flips the person first language to really emphasize disability, and in my case, right, neurodivergence, as a positive aspect of a person's identity. Research is sort of indicating that this is the preference, but as I just said on the previous slide, like we all have our different preferences around language. But I'm going to stick with identity first language because it's my preference and was the preference for a lot of my participants as well. All right, so now a little bit about my project. This was a three-year project now. And I started this research because librarianship is a field that really appears to be appealing to neurodivergent people. And yet the library literature largely overlooks the existence of all of us who are neurodivergent and working in libraries. Furthermore, the core values of librarianship aren't really consistently practiced in the workplace side of the library. And while there is research on neurodiversity employment, a lot of that focuses on IT fields and places like Microsoft, that sort of thing. And they haven't looked at these service-oriented fields like librarianship yet. So the goal of my work then is really to adjust the norms and expectations of librarianship so that we all can enact new workplace practices and improve our culture to really increase the capacity of libraries to recruit and onboard and retain and especially advance neurodivergent library workers in this field. One important aspect of my research that I always try and emphasize, because this is really important to me as a neurodivergent researcher myself, is to do research differently on purpose. Because for so long and still in the US, there's so much funding that goes to neurodiversity research that's done to neurodivergent people from this very medicalized perspective. And we're seeing that increase here in the US in particular with changes in the politics and the administration here. My work works in opposition to that framing. I adopt a neurodiversity and critical disability theory approach to conducting this kind of research by researching with and by us neurodivergent people ourselves. So I'll go over quickly the design of my study. Basically, there were 4 phases. I began with interviews in phase 1. Phase 2 was a big nationwide survey here in the US. In the 3rd phase, I did participatory design sessions to help determine what kind of resources, training would be helpful for our organizations. And then as we were beginning the toolkit, our grant was terminated. So we are still trying to put some pieces of that together and figure out how we can hopefully get that available later this year. Used a theoretical framework that's based on a framework that comes from the neurodiversity employment literature, but I modified this to acknowledge the role that this idea of what it means to be a librarian and this sense of professional culture, how that influences both the attitudes that are present in the workplace, as well as the barriers and opportunities that are present in our workplaces. And then I also specifically wanted to name the lived experience that neurodivergent people bring to their workplace from living in a world that wasn't built for them. If you heard my talk earlier this year, that talk really focused on the barriers and opportunities. I'm going to do a brief overview of that here today. But as I said earlier, the thing that this is like, I'm really excited about that I get to talk about this because this is so important to me. And then we're going to get to talk about this today because that's the focus of what I'm talking about with all of you here today. So I ran through all that quickly, and this is a reminder to myself that I need to take a deep breath. This is also a good time for you to check and make sure that you're comfortable and that you have everything you need before we dig into some of the details about this work. And I'm going to take a sip of coffee. All right, and now we can move on to some of those details. So as I said, I'm going to begin with this quick overview, just so you have some context for what the neurodivergent librarians are responding to in their workplaces. And as I said, it was really important for me to hear from neurodivergent librarians directly. So I did 50 interviews, and that included 17 interviews with neurodivergent library supervisors. And generally, they reported that they experienced a lot of exclusion in their workplace and they experienced things like stereotypes and stigma. They worried about encountering discrimination, and they felt isolated and left out from their workplace and the social and professional aspects of that workplace. They reported that their work environment was inaccessible, sometimes in multiple ways. That could be things like being in a busy place in the library where there were a lot of distractions. It could be lighting, temperature, all of those sorts of things. They also talked a lot about how expectations were so unclear in our libraries, that they were unclear on policies and when you were strict about a rule or when to bend a rule, and what was expected of them. And there were so many unspoken expectations that it felt like they were navigating this whole sort of hidden curriculum in their workplaces. And they also talked about how differences did not feel welcome. And if they were interested in seeking accommodations process, that process was very unclear and highly bureaucratic. They also talked about how they often, it fell to them to educate their colleagues because their colleagues didn't know about neurodiversity or had a lot of misconceptions about what neurodiversity was and what that might look like, especially in adults. And then, of course, all of these barriers were amplified with other intersecting identities. In fact, the influence of individual differences could make a big difference on how people experienced these same barriers. For some of the library workers I spoke with, their history of trauma was influencing how they were understanding themselves and how they were navigating triggers in their workplace. And the librarians I spoke with who had multiple intersectional identities, including gender, racial, and ethnic identities, also talked about how they were encountering multiple forms of oppression and discrimination in their workplaces. They didn't just get to be like one aspect of their identity, right? They were all of those things at once. And so they experienced all of those forms of marginalization together. And that could be very compounding for them. Additionally, the librarians talked about how they were sort of expected to perform neuronormativity, sorry, it's early here, and this gendered care that's so often expected of us in library work, while they and their neurodivergence were being misunderstood or even not believed. The library profession also created barriers as well. While the professional values, the librarians I spoke with talked about how the values of the profession really aligned well with their personal and professional values, that they enjoyed helping others so much. That's what it attracted them to this profession. And yet here they were in this workplace and in this field that claimed to value things like access and equity and inclusion for patrons. Often they were doing that work themselves, and yet they were finding that that value was not enacted in their workplaces. And especially because this service orientation of the library was so strong, they talked about, understaffing. They were wearing too many hats and taking up the work of colleagues who had left. And this really resulted in this idea of like sacrificing yourself as part of what it means to be a librarian. And the professional standards and competencies, especially a lot of the documents here that we use in the US from the American Library Association, really demand this hyper-able librarian who prioritizes service over their own needs. And of course, neurotypical expectations dominate throughout the profession and throughout these workplaces, creating all of these additional barriers for those of us who are neurodivergent. So that's the overview then of the barriers and some context for the ways that the library workers that I spoke with talked about how they navigate these barriers. And they do this by enacting what I call embodied knowledge, which I will explain in a moment. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the people who participated in this study, because this process of navigating these barriers was very complicated for them because so many of them had identified their neurodivergence as adults. And so they talked about how they were still engaged in this process of learning to understand their own needs and their authentic ways of being in the world, and how they'd become so accustomed to adapting on their own that they really weren't even sure what to ask for or what other possibilities might exist for them. And yet a number of them did talk about how during the early days of the pandemic, that change in working conditions and work processes where so many people were able to work from home, they talked about how that was such a learning moment for them because they realized that work could be different. It could be less harmful for them. And so they were trying to sort of carry that into their workplace as they sort of returned to work with this sense that other things were possible. One of the participants said, and this is where the title for today's presentation comes from, "You deserve to take care of yourself. I didn't realize I had needs. I never saw them, and I didn't realize that they were worth honoring above any sort of achievement or pat on the back. Like, we can just take care of ourselves first." And this is the kind of revelation, that people talked about having as they were coming to understand their needs and what that could mean for them in their workplace. And so this then brings me to this thing that I call embodied knowledge. And so this is a way of acknowledging the lived experience and really the expertise that neurodivergent people have developed from making do, right? From taking care of their own needs and living in a world that isn't built for us. And this builds on a disability studies concept that comes from Tobin Siebers and his conception of what he calls complex embodiment as disability knowledge. And this is the idea really that the neurodivergent library workers are drawing on their experience with marginalization and are developing these practices and strategies in the workplace for navigating access, so access and inclusion writ broadly. And in these ways, they are often sort of circumventing or upending even the neuronormativity and ableism that is so deeply present in their workplaces. So you're probably wondering what this looks like. And sometimes it can look like workplace assimilation, where you try and blend in, you fit, right? You counter that feeling of exclusion, of feeling isolated by trying to fit in. And that really is still a form of enacting embodied knowledge, right? It means things like this consistently high performance, or, if you're overachiever club, hi, that's me too. It means masking, right? Concealing some of your neurodivergent ways of being. It may mean things like providing your own adjustments. People talked about things like, they'd bring in lighting, that sort of things. It can look like self-medicating. People talked about things like drinking too much alcohol when they went home or on the weekends, or people talked about how much they relied on their coffee to get through the day. That sounded very familiar. So maybe you have similar experiences. And they also talked about how they really approach disclosure as a last resort. And what this means is that they were not open about disclosing. They really saw disclosure as a means of explaining something that has gone awry, right? So they would only share something about their neurodivergence if there was an issue or a problem that arose that they needed to explain why that had been a problem or an issue, or why they had responded in that way. Then they might resort to disclosure. But it wasn't something that they shared before that kind of moment in their workplace. As you can see, right, one of my participants said, I haven't gotten official accommodations, but I have adopted a lot of strategies. And so I'm going to share a few more of those strategies with you here as well, because I thought they were pretty cool. So other forms of embodied knowledge that weren't assimilation were really about sort of getting around some of these ableist expectations in the workplace. So people talked about how they were doing things to adapt their own workspace environment. And this included both physical aspects of the library as well as more sensory aspects of the environment. For people who didn't have their own office space, they talked about how they would identify and use a space they could retreat to, a quiet area of their library. One person even talked about how like they'd hid their box of tissues there for when things got really overwhelming, and they knew that they would have this spot where they could let it out and recover. And so they'd made this, little hidden area in their library. They also talked about all of the many digital tools that they were using to manage their work and often their personal lives as well. A couple of participants talked about it as like their external brain, right? And so they were offloading some of these cognitive tasks to digital tools. They also used physical tools in a similar manner. And they also talked about how helpful it was for them to develop informal neurodiversity community, much like the one you all have here. And sometimes it was just one coworker, right, who they had disclosed with. It could be a network in a regional area, a smaller group through like a state library organization. Sometimes it was just a community of friends. But having that neurodiversity community really helped people think about how to honor themselves, I think I would say, and those have someone to go to be like, was this super ableist? Yes, it was. Thank you very much. I thought it was, but I feel so much better now that you all have confirmed that. This neurodiversity community then could also be another form of support through things like body doubling, all right, where you would work on your independent projects together at the same time and provide some of that accountability to be able to get work tasks done. And then the neurodivergent library workers I spoke with also talked about all the ways in which they were acting as an agent of change. And this was especially true of the supervisors because they had more of that leadership role. So I'll talk more about that in a bit. But first I want to talk a little bit more about some of the ways, some details about these ways that the library workers are bringing this embodied knowledge to their workplaces. Oops, I skipped a slide there. There we go. So first we're going to talk a little bit about the ways they were adapting their own workspace. So as I mentioned, this could include things like bringing in lamps because everyone talked about how awful the lighting was in their libraries. People also shared that they were doing things like bringing in a weighted or a cozy blanket. And this is a library talk, so there's the obligatory cat picture. But they were doing things like this, not only for some temperature control, but also for that sort of sensory aspect of that as well, right? Wanting that extra weight or something soft to touch in their office. A number of them also had gotten permission or had just brought white noise machines to their office to help remediate some of the distracting noise that's present in library workplaces. For people who had offices, they emphasized the importance of having the ability to have closed door time and close that door and create that retreat space for themselves. One person, their organization provided everyone with yoga mats, which I thought was cool. But a couple of other people talked about how they'd brought in their own yoga mat or like a carpet square or a throw rug for when they just like needed to be on the floor. So they had a clean space to do that. They talked about ways to control the temperature in their office area. HVAC in libraries is always an issue. So they'd bring a fan or a heater. And then they talked about how they would have quiet music, you know, whether that was soft in their office or through things like headphones, right? Having that, again, like the white noise, right? That sensory input in a way that was helpful instead of a way that was unhelpful for them. They also shared some of the digital tools that they had used, and unsurprisingly, right, this included things like calendar. I'm one of those people where I rely a lot on my calendar, and that was one of the things the participants talked about a lot too. They also used project management tools, things like Trello, Kanban boards, that sort of thing, and task lists and reminders. Sometimes these things were all integrated, right? But basically, so you could get that reminder, oh, here's when this needs to be done. And you could see like what you had done and what your progress was. They also used time blocking on their calendars. So they put things like lunch on their calendar so they wouldn't forget to eat lunch. So I learned to do that too from my participants because I am one of those people who will definitely forget to eat lunch. And they would also do things like block off quiet time or prep time. Like, you know, I need to work on preparation for this workshop or this instruction session. And so really making sure that they put those kinds of things, blocked them off on their calendar so they would have the time for them. They also would, if they, you know, wrote an email that could be used again, that they'd save that as a template so that you didn't have to sort of start from scratch the next time, that long cognitive on-ramp. They could just go to their templates and have some language to work with already. A lot of them also talked about how they were using their smartwatch for all sorts of things, both personal and professional. You know, they'd get a notification on their watch when their kiddo got home from school. They'd get reminders to move, to drink water, all of those sorts of things. And then relatedly, you know, they talked about using hydration trackers to remember to have their water and to keep track of how they were doing in that regard as well. And then some of the participants also talked about some of the physical tools that they had used, things like visual timers. I have mine here today. They talked about how they were color coding their files, their tasks. Sometimes they were doing it on their digital calendars as well, but using this color coding as a visual reminder of the things that they were working on and keeping themselves organized. Although some people really leaned more towards the digital, there were participants who said that doesn't work for me. I forget it exists. I need this physical object in my hand. And so they would have their like everything planner where they kept all of their notes and their calendar and would take that with them everywhere. And so they really emphasized that like physical aspect of writing it down to help them remember that. And a number of them also talked about like using headphones or those filter ear loops. There are a couple different brands of them, if you know what I'm talking about, but you can select how they'll filter out sound. And a couple participants had said that like finding those was so life-changing for them because it really experienced how they encountered both their workspace, but also the world as a whole. And we also shared a lot of tips about different kinds of fidgets. I spent a lot of time, we were holding up fidgets and comparing things, but all different kinds, right? Things that would click, things that were soft. I have a bunch on my desk, things you can squish, right? All of those sorts of different things, and having like a collection of them on your desk so that you could, pick the one that suited your need at the moment. And then one of my participants shared what I thought was the coolest thing. I've not forgotten this, and I share it anytime I talk about these things because I thought it was, I know it was something that would have been so helpful to me. But basically, she had a tray of blocks on her desk, and she would use them to keep track of her energy each day. And so if she had a really intense meeting in the day, she might remove or change the color of like four, 6 blocks, right? She'd take them out or change the color. And then, maybe there was, a challenging interaction with a patron, and you take out a couple more blocks, and then it helps you sort of stay on aware of what your energy levels are and how much energy you've expended already, so that when you get to say 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that you aren't sort of wondering like, why am I so exhausted? What has happened today? Oh, well, you look at your tray and you realize I've spent so much energy today. Now I do need a quieter task with maybe that requires less of my sort of cognitive mental energy. And so I thought that was such a cool thing. Yeah, so I love sharing that one. And then a number of people also talked about how they, bring their knitting, their crocheting with them and into meetings, right? They gotten permission or they just did it because it was such an important way of actually helping them pay attention by having their hands busy, and that really enabled them to focus on what was happening in those spaces. And then I promised you I would tell you about the supervisors because they were so focused on what they could alter in their workplace for the benefit of other people in their workplace. And so they talked about how they were able to be more understanding of differences and empathetic toward their direct reports, but toward their peers as well, drawing on this embodied knowledge, right? This experience with marginalization. And so they were also then using the power of their role to create organizational change. So they were doing things like reviewing policies. They were trying to make all of those hidden expectations clearer and actually articulated somewhere in those library policies. They were doing things like creating groups and working on establishing meeting norms so that they were clear about like, here's how we come together. And then here's how we communicate afterwards, right? So they were also creating processes like we will share the agenda 24 hours in advance. We will send out minutes afterwards. Here's where all the minutes will be kept. And so they were doing all these things to, they might be seen as small steps, but, for the people in that workplace, they were making all of these things that otherwise were so hidden. They were really working to make change in a way where those things were much more transparent and clear. And then additionally, they were also using the power of that leadership role in their library to support and hire other neurodivergent employees who might not be given a chance if they were seen through that neurotypical lens. And so they were really advocating for neurodivergent employees in a way that wasn't happening in other spaces in their organization, and trying to educate the organization as well about that. And so they really stressed the importance of advancing more neurodivergent library workers into these kinds of supervisory roles because of the ways that they felt they were able to bring new perspectives and to help advance the profession. With all of that said, however, it is important to acknowledge that all of this embodied knowledge is being enacted by an individual. And so all of this effort then comes with a lasting toll and was exacting short-term and long-term costs on the physical and mental well-being of these participants. Disability studies scholar Margaret Price calls this the emotional cost, right? This constant sort of triage of having to decide, oh, is this comment worth pursuing now? Do I have the energy to deal with that? Or, do I just maintain my mask and let it go because I have other things that are more important that need my energy? And it's physical cost, it's emotional cost, it is monetary cost as well, right? People buying all these things to bring to their workplaces. And so there's this real burden that is being placed upon all of these neurodivergent individuals as they are working to navigate this ableism and neuronormativity that is so baked into these library organizations. As one of my participants said, I just want there to be more authenticity about how we're all humans and we all deal with different things. So let's just be okay with that. The librarians that I spoke with generally wanted their organizations to not just be more inclusive of them, but to be more inclusive of everyone. And as one of the participants said, I'm sure that plenty of organizations will point at their formal policies, like we have an anti-harassment policy, we have an anti-bullying policy. What more do you want? And it's like, well, I'd like your culture to shift so that people are more willing to go, maybe I've got somebody with a brain that works differently than mine, rather than this person is not cut out for this work. And so the library workers I interviewed were really pushing for a different culture in their workplaces, for a culture of what I call collective care. A culture where the organization was working to build workplace access and inclusion and equity transparently and collectively, like together, right? And for everyone, so that this wasn't just a special individual request, but rather was seen as a regular and ongoing practice of librarianship, of like what it means to be a librarian, that we do this together in our workplaces. And then that is the thing that can help create this access for everyone if we do this work together. And so to address this exclusion of neurodivergent librarians, then I argue that library organizations really have to address all forms of structural exclusion and oppression. They need to do things like incorporating trauma-aware practices into their workplace, to attend to all of these gendered conceptions of care that are such a deep part of this profession, and to recognize and value this expertise of neurodivergent library workers and these supervisors in ways that don't further burden them and demand additional labor from them. And again, really approach access as an organizational culture issue that requires organizational change rather than maintaining the system where everyone's doing all of this work and taking up all of this labor on their own as an individual. Because library organizations could learn so much from all of the neurodivergent librarians who participated in this study and all the ways that they are working to normalize differences and to redefine their workplaces and what it means to be a librarian as they are dismantling these ableist practices and attitudes in their workplaces. And so with that, then I will say again, we are hoping to have this toolkit later this year. It will include things like training and resources for supervisors. I'm working on a success kit for us neurodivergent library workers and more. So please stay tuned and keep your fingers crossed that we can find some funding to make that possible. For the curious participants, here are some of my references. There's a lot more obviously in my dissertation. So if you're really curious about all of this and have lots of time, it's very long, I will warn you. But there's lots more there. And with that, then I will thank you all for having me here today. It's always such a joy and a privilege to share this work. So I really appreciate you welcoming me today. And with that, I want to move to questions. And I just, sort of have a few reminders here, that if you have something that's really an individual question, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, I try and make this a space where we can answer questions that will be meaningful for everyone. All right, so thank you. And I'm gonna find my thing and stop sharing there. But if there's, a slide you want me to reference or something, let me know, I can turn that back on.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Christine. We've had lots and lots of comments in the chat, but I would say not so many questions. Now, there is a question that I'll answer about the slides being available. So you should have had a link to the PDF version of the slides I sent out from Eventbrite, but if you registered, I think since Friday, you won't have received that because I sent that on Friday. So we will be uploading a PowerPoint version of the slides to the output section of the NLISN website. So I'll just put a link to that part of the website in the chat, because you can see outputs from previous events on there already, but they will get put up on there later this week, along with the recording as well. So if anybody does have other questions, you are welcome to use the chat. If anybody would prefer to ask verbally, you can also use the raise hand function. So you should be able to see that on the top of the screen. And you're more than welcome to then verbally unmute to ask questions as well. Given that there's been no other questions come through already, Christine, do you want to manage them in the chat yourself from now on?
Sure, yeah, I can do that. I've just opened the chat, so yes. Oh, thank you. We're trying to figure some things out. There's a question in the chat about helping with funding. So thank you so much. We are hoping to have some funding from the University of Washington. It's just complicated because things in higher ed are very complicated right now, especially funding here in the US. So I think we do have it. We just have to figure out like all of the processes we need to follow to make that happen. But thank you so much for asking. I really appreciate that. It's very kind of you. Let's see. So there's a long question here I'm reading. Yeah, okay, so there's a long question here about sort of managing workload. And I think really it's about like having all of this experience and then trying to advance in the profession, given the complexities of what it means to, and the difficulties with working a full-time job as someone who is neurodivergent. And I think, I would say that a lot of the supervisors, this isn't to be discouraging, but rather to sort of acknowledge, I think, the complexity. I don't know what it's like there, but here in the US, a lot of the supervisors acknowledged that they had stumbled into a leadership role Some of them did talk about how they had really crafted narratives about the ways in which their experiences were demonstrating leadership. And so, maybe that's something that, I don't know if you have done, but that might be a suggestion, is to really think about how all of your previous experience, pull out everything that's about leadership. Because at least here in the US, when you take on those leadership roles, people really want that kind of leadership service, even if it's come from, working retail, right, or some kind of customer service role. Thinking about all of those differences, experiences, like I saw as charity, right, curating multiple programs, lean into those things that demonstrate that leadership if you aren't already, to help you demonstrate your ability to do that kind of work. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's kind of the best answer I have at the moment based on the information and what I heard from participants. And then I saw that there was a question about the mix of participants. It did lean slightly toward academic librarians. And honestly, that makes sense because they're the ones who have more time to participate in interviews and this kind of research. The public librarians I spoke with were actually often participating on their own time, whereas academic librarians were scheduling during the day, which I thought was interesting. So it definitely leaned more that way. And I did sort of look at them and actually things like barriers and embodied knowledge, they were very similar across both public and academic libraries. So there weren't any really specific trends. There might be small things where, the public librarians were less likely to have their own office space than the academic librarians, but, it was just a slight trend in that way. So there were some maybe small differences than that, but mostly it was a lot of similarities and experiences. Did you consider, so actually there's a question about whether I had spoken with neurotypical librarians, and I did a bunch of, I think 36 or 37 interviews with neurotypical librarians to get to this, what's at the heart of your question, right? Their perception, their knowledge, their attitudes. And I didn't talk about that today, but I will say I did touch on that a little in the calc talk. So you can watch that online. And then I will just say briefly here that, of course, the people I talked to wanted to participate in this research. So they were coming from a place of wanting to make change, but feeling like they knew that they didn't have the knowledge or the expertise. They weren't even sure how to get started. And so while there were the good intentions there, it was really hard for them to take any steps forward because they didn't know what to do or how to get the right kind of knowledge, right? There was concern about that as well on their part. And they're part of our survey too. We got a lot of information from them about how they view their workplaces and their libraries. Let's see. Sorry, trying to read and answer at the same time and be mindful of everyone's time here today too. Yes, there were more women who participated in the research than men. There was also a high rate of gender diversity as well. And so, yes, I see you talking about how, right, that might be part of why I saw this high rate of people who were later diagnosed in life. But some of the men who participated were also in that category of being later diagnosed and experiencing some of these same things with masking and the toll that was taking on them as well. So there's a question here about representation of us neurodivergent people in the LIS sector. And my sense from this study is that we are much more a part of this profession than our neurotypical peers seem to recognize or understand. In fact, it was one of my codes for the interviews was just the prevalence of all of us neurodivergent library workers. And everyone I spoke to was like, oh yeah, two of my colleagues, a bunch of my friends. And so it was like, felt like I was just uncovering this whole wide network of neurodivergent workers in LIS that hadn't previously been acknowledged before. And I get the sense, from my interviews and other people that I've heard from, that people really are drawn to this profession for the thing that I mentioned, right? That it does align well with personal values. A number of the participants talked about, intentionally coming to libraries because they felt like they could have that social justice orientation in this field in ways which they couldn't necessarily in corporate work. And so they really felt that the culture of the profession was a better fit for them than other kinds of work. And your question there about senior staff, that's harder for me to answer. Obviously, I did interview some supervisors, but I'm not sure, 16, 17, that's enough to really be able to say what representation looks like at those higher levels of leadership. So I'm not sure I have a good sense of that at this point.
And there's quite a few non-questions come through, so I've just pulled out the other couple that I think are more for you to help a little bit with navigating some of that noise.
Appreciate it.
So there's a question in there about informal neurodivergent LIS communities as a form of embodied knowledge. So do you think that this can relate to advocacy as a group for better understanding of neurodivergence within the profession?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the cases where I was talking about, here in the US, we don't really have an organization like yours, right? And so much of this was being done, I don't know, like almost behind the scenes. And yeah, I think for people it was providing this space to do some of that kind of collective work, like I was mentioning in some of my final slides, right? To figure out how they could advocate together for certain things, or even like coming up with those ideas of like, what can we change in this workplace, right? How do we go about that? And so in those kinds of cases, I think they are helping to support that kind of advocacy and improvement of understanding, in that they are enabling people to do that work.
And then we've just got time for one last question, and we only have one left, so that's very good. So there's a question about the breakdown of your analysis. So did you break down any of the analysis of your research by type of neurodivergence? And if so, did you see any general trends of experiences that were different between them?
Yes, we did, especially from our nationwide survey, because we had so much more participation there, right? So there was a lot more data to work with. I think it was like 286 responses to the survey. And interestingly enough, I would say that what we found was that it was more a question of degree. And I've done a presentation on this just recently, but I don't have exact numbers. So, forgive me there. But for example, the autistic participants experienced masking as as a barrier in their workplace to a much higher degree than the ADHD participants. And the ADHD participants were much reported that they were more often openly disclosing than their autistic peers, who reported that they were much less likely to disclose. So it wasn't necessarily that, you know, it was an on and off kind of thing. It was really a matter of degree amongst some of those different forms of neurodivergence, if that makes sense.
Yes, well, it makes sense to me. Thank you so much for your time today, Christy, your presentation. It's been really, really interesting. And I'm so pleased we were able to work out a time zone that just about worked for both of us here and for attendees. So for anyone in the UK who might be interested in attending NLISN's next in-person event, which is in Leeds on the 6th of October, it actually follows a very similar theme to Christine's research. So it's looking at adjustments in the workplace. I'm just going to put a link in the chat to that event. And we will have some more online events with single or paired speakers coming up over the next few months as well. So we'll have another one of those in November and then into the new year. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I'll send you an email either towards the end of this week or Monday next week with an evaluation form and a reminder of where you can find the slides and the recording. And we would really appreciate it if you can fill that evaluation form in, both for the NLISN committee about our events in general, but also any comments that are specific for Christine. I will share those as well.
Great, thank you.
That's